Hola, buenas tardes. Uh, I didn't say this in my last talk, but before I begin, I just wanted to say how grateful I am to be here. I really owe most of my career to the open source community, and it is very gracious of you to fly me here and allow me to speak in my own language, and you would still listen. And yeah, if it wasn't for the open source community, I wouldn't be able to do what I do, so thank you. So this is wield AngularJS like a pro. How many people are experienced with AngularJS already, used it in a project? Okay, so about half. I'm assuming the rest of you at least know what it is. All right. So I'll spend a little bit of time on intro stuff and explain, and then we'll go into crazy complicated things after that. So quickly, a little bit about me. My name is Nate Abele. I used to be the lead developer of Cake PHP. I'm a founder and currently developer of the Lithium PHP framework. How many people have heard of Lithium? Sweet. How many of you are actually using it or have used it? Okay. That's okay. That's cool. You guys are awesome. The rest of you are good too, don't get me wrong. And I'm also a member of the AngularUI team, which we'll be talking a little bit about today. And you can follow me on Twitter if you're into that sort of thing. So what is AngularJS? To summarize briefly, AngularJS is comprised of these main features. Two-way data binding and live HTML templating expressions let you, bind inputs and evaluate the output without writing any JavaScript. You don't have to bind all of your events in JavaScript code. It has a dependency injection system, making testing really easy and making it really easy to construct complex applications. And the module system lets you organize things into logical groups. So we'll be looking at a few of these things. So why is AngularJS so hard? Everybody says, AngularJS is so complicated and so different. I think this owes mainly to two things. First of all, Angular and Ember and Knockout and all of these other different frameworks are part of a new wave of JavaScript frameworks that completely reverse the perspective that we've all been used to for years and years about designing front-end applications. Typically, you would create an HTML page and then load some JavaScript that would modify the page, but the truth was always in the HTML. The HTML was always your data model. And this reverses that so that the truth is always in JavaScript. You have your JavaScript objects and your domain models and services and things all in JavaScript, dictating to the HTML what to render. Also, there are lots and lots of new terms. Angular provides many, many different ways to organize code. And when you begin, it may seem a little bit intimidating, but it's all actually very simple. Most of it is just functions. So just a brief overview of what each thing is. A controller is, again, just a JavaScript function that manages a scope. And a scope in AngularJS is just a region of a page. So you would assign a controller to a DOM node, usually. And that controller would manage all of the data that's presented in that region of the page. So it's really, really simple. A directive in AngularJS is, again, just a function that is assigned in the DOM. So you can use attributes or elements or even comments or CSS classes to assign directives to different elements on the page, and then you can use simple JavaScript functions to attach behavior to those DOM elements. And again, the way that you construct a directive is really simple. It's just you provide a definition, and the main part is simply a function that takes in the element and assigns behavior to it. Provider services and factories, they're all essentially the same thing. There are different ways of constructing JavaScript objects and classes to expose behavior to your controllers and directives. And again, it's all just JavaScript functions. Filters are kind of a unique feature of Angular. They're a templating expression, so you would put this in a template and it would render out currency. They have filters for dates, for filtering lists in different ways. But secretly, filters are actually just a service. So you can inject them in controllers and call them like this, and it will give you the same result, which is really handy if you're filtering lists of things. There's a filter, where you just give it an object, and it will filter all of the objects in an array that match this constraint. So it's really easy to use when you're manipulating data in controllers. Or especially in templates, if you want to present if you have a set of data and you want to present just a particular section of it, or just a slice and a particular view, filters will help you do that really easily. So I'm going to go through just a couple of the tools that I use when I'm developing Angular apps. And the reason I'm sitting here instead of walking around and talking to you is because, unlike my last talk, I'm actually going to try and present some code, and maybe we'll do some development together. So first of all, Yeoman and Bower and these different JavaScript package managers and Bootstrap tools, I don't really use any of them. You can. They just, to me, in my experience so far, having tried to use them, they just seem like more trouble than they're worth. Now Batarang, on the other hand, Batarang is a very useful tool. It's an extension for Chrome, and it allows you to debug complex Angular applications really, really easily. So when you're in the inspector, you'll have this tab on the side that'll let you see scope variables for all the scope variables that are available in the context of that DOM element. And you can click through and you see this thing called parent. You can actually use that to traverse up the scope tree because all scopes are inherited, and actually see everything cascading all the way through to the particular element that you've selected. It gives you another tab that actually lets you traverse through the scope tree itself to see all the scopes on the page at a given time and all the model data that's attached to each one of them. Another feature that it has is it exposes all the services that your application is using in a graph, and you can mouse over them and see which ones are dependent on others. And finally, probably the most important part is the profiler that watches all of your expressions that are rendering on a page to determine, like, if your page is slow, why is it slow, which expressions are hurting your performance. So you can see here I've got a function called render, another expression called where I'm referencing a piece of information and translating it with this translate filter that I wrote. So you can just kind of go through and see the different times that these different things are taking and figure out how to optimize your application really easily. So what about AngularUI? AngularUI is the sort of unofficially official companion suite for AngularJS. It's got a bunch of tools and sort of official community things for AngularJS. We work directly a lot with the core team, and a lot of people some people who are on the Angular core team started out in AngularUI. So if you're looking to contribute to the AngularJS community, AngularUI is a really good place to get your feet wet. AngularUI basically offers 3 different kinds of things. There's a utilities library, which just has a few commonly used application pieces that you would want. A lot of things for if you're working a lot with jQuery or jQuery libraries, any jQuery UI stuff. There's utilities in there that will allow you to easily bind events to jQuery UI elements. It also has a lot of wrapper modules for editors like CodeMirror and Ace. Maps like Google Maps and, well, yeah. So you can just go to angularui.github.io, and if the internet still works, that's okay. Oh, wait, oh. There it is. So again, these are all the modules. A lot of these are just wrappers for different, like TinyMCE, Select2. We're actually working on migrating a lot of these so that they don't have any dependencies on jQuery or jQuery plugins. Because you get a lot of performance benefits and the files are way smaller, particularly with UI Bootstrap. So UI Bootstrap is a module for AngularUI that completely replaces all of Twitter Bootstrap's JavaScript. It completely re-implements all of Twitter Bootstrap's JavaScript components. So you only need UI Bootstrap and Twitter Bootstrap CSS, and you have all of their components that perform better, work better with AngularJS, and your file sizes are much smaller. So if you go to angularui.github.io/bootstrap, you can see we have all of the different components in Angular UI Bootstrap. And again, this is all really simple stuff to integrate. So carousel, for example, like many of these, is exposed as a directive, which in this case is a custom tag where you set your properties, and it's really, really simple stuff. By the way, if anybody has any questions on anything, feel free to raise your hand and stop me. UI Router is the project that I'm mainly contributing to, and it is a routing and state machine infrastructure for Angular. So to explain it simply, here is the demo, and this is what the state tree for the demo looks like. So we have the home page here, and then you can navigate to contacts, navigate through each contact. Now you notice it's using history push state. The page isn't reloading, but the URL bar changes. This is currently in hash mode, so you see the hash there. You can also use it in HTML5 mode, which you don't see this ugly hash here. And there are, if you go into the documentation for UI Router, there are different server setups where if somebody reloads the page, it'll still navigate to the correct state. So really quickly going back to the state tree here, you have the root state, which is kind of always implicit. And then you have the home state, which is here, and you can kind of see the details about the state name and the URL. And then as we navigate through, you'll notice that there's this state here called contacts. So if I click on contacts, I'm not actually going to the contact state. This is contacts.list. It's because contacts is a what's called an abstract state. You can't actually navigate to it, but it allows you to organize your state hierarchy in a particular way and attach behavior to a whole section of a tree of states at once without having to duplicate that logic. So I've navigated to contacts.list. I see my list of contacts, and now if I click on one, it's navigating over to contacts.detail, and you can see I have these other states that I can drill down into. So the detail for an item, and then I can actually hit edit. Now if you watch, this item has a URL, but now I've just navigated to a different state, even though that doesn't have a URL. States don't have to have URLs attached, but if you want to use the backwards and forwards buttons to navigate between states, they do need to have a URL. So any questions on any of this so far? Yes?
Where do you define the tree?
Where do you define the tree? I'll show you.
Or when?
When?
When or where, I don't know.
Okay. You define the tree in the... So are you familiar with how AngularJS starts up, how you have the config phase?
So.
Okay. Well, here, we'll actually just take a look. Oh, that's kind of ugly.
Can you define it in some way that you don't expose all the backend logic you're using?
Okay. When you say backend logic,
for example, if you have a server with a backend, you don't want to expose sometimes your models or your actions.
Okay, sure. So this is actually completely front end, what we're seeing here. And your URL structure that you define in your state tree is totally, completely independent from anything that goes on your back end. So what you're actually seeing here, let me see if I can get back to it. What you're seeing here is completely front end code. And actually, I'll get into one of the apps that I'm working on. Here, let me, over here. I'm going to show you one of the apps that I'm working on, which is actually two completely separate repositories. So one is just the UI, the front end, and it's completely static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript.
Yeah, I meant, for example, when you are trying to persist the data,
Mm-hmm.
you use what kind of technology? For example, if you want to go with a DB or something.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we'll get into that shortly.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No worries. So you define your states in code like this. The UI router offers two primary providers that you will use, the state provider and the URL router provider. So the router provider allows you to do some route-specific things like redirect from one type of one URL to another, or have a catch-all where if you navigate to a URL that doesn't exist, it can redirect you. And then the state providers where you actually define your states. So you have the home state, and here I'm just defining the template in line in code. But what you would normally do is you would say, template URL equals home.html, something like that. And then here I'm defining a context state, setting the URL template, giving it a template to load. And then here is where I'm actually loading things from the database. So I have a service called contacts that talks to my database, and it's going to inject itself, the full list of contacts. It's going to take that and inject it in my controller as contacts. So here's my controller. What you would normally do in a real app is you would say, controller equals contacts, controller, like that. But this is just a sample app, so we just do it in line. So here we're injecting our scope, the actual state service that allows us to navigate between states and get information about our states. And then the contacts that we injected from here. And then some utility stuff to manage the data. So does that sort of answer your question about like interacting with the data? Okay. Yeah. It's so one of the interesting features about Angular that is kind of different from other frameworks of its kind is that it doesn't actually have like a traditional model system. Your models are whatever you assign to scope that's exposed in the template. So it doesn't impose on you in that way. You can use any kind of JavaScript persistence library that you want, because anything that you attach to scope is just plain old JavaScript objects that can be anything. So now I will, if I can get my browser back, here we go. So that's the basic example. Now I'd like to actually show you a real app that I've been working on at my company for a client. It's an app to manage assets related to films and film productions. So we have, let's see. So we have the code here. Let me just format this out, make it a little bigger. So this system again is for managing projects related to movies. So we have a bunch of movies, and you can click in and see, like we have this really nice smooth animation as we navigate between our different states. So I can click on this, and there's a trailer that doesn't load because I'm local.
Excuse me.
Yes.
That's all the animations. Do you make it with Angular?
Mm-hmm. So Angular has an animation system based on CSS3, and I can show you how that's done here. So I have this state called project. Let me resize this. So I have this state called projects that's an abstract state. It manages both the index and the view state. So these are two different states that have the same parent. And here I'm just using an inline template because I need an extra view. So this view is where you kind of drop your templates into as you're navigating through states. So this view has, it assigns a particular animation to it, so that any of its children, when you transition from one child to the other, it should use that animation. So this is actually the old Angular animation API example. Currently for this project we're using Angular 1.1.5, and Angular 1.2 has a completely rewritten animation framework where you don't have to use special directives. So for example, if I wanted to add a class to something in Angular, I'd come over here and say ng class equals, active true. And this expression, whenever it's just like a regular JavaScript object, and when this expression evaluates to true, this class will be applied. So I could say, if project, suppose I had something called like an active field on my project, I could say if project.active, and if project.active evaluates true, this class will be applied. Now I never have to worry about adding or removing that class again. It's just there if the project is active and gone if it's not. So the new animation system actually just works with ng class and other directives that add and remove classes. So if those classes have any transitions in them, then they'll be applied, and Angular will sort of act accordingly.
So you're working with CSS3 animations?
Yes.
And if the browser is not it doesn't support CSS3 animations, what?
So it gives you a couple of different alternatives. The main one is that the animation doesn't happen. The second is that Angular actually exposes a new. So you remember how we had all that list, that list of all the different types of things that Angular allows you to make. So animation is actually a new type of thing as of 1.1.5, and that allows you to define your animations in JavaScript. And so this animation that we're using here, it's actually part CSS3, but part JavaScript, because so if you notice in this particular transition, when I click on a movie, it stays, but the other ones go. So we couldn't do that in just CSS. That required some JavaScript. So that one's actually a hybrid. And that is actually the solution for if you are trying to target browsers that don't support CSS3 animations. You can actually just pull in like jQuery or whatever other animation library you want and define that animation in JavaScript.
Okay, thank you.
So let's see. So this is the view definition for each one of these. You notice the views have names. So with this interface, I can actually target different views in different states. So here in my project state, that's kind of a like the root view for the project, or the root state for the project rather. And I could have a view defined, let's say somewhere up here. And if I wanted to target that from another state to render a template in this header, then I could just say, navbar, here, navbar at projects. So if I created in up here a view called navbar, then I could target it and say, here's a controller, here's a template, render that stuff. Does that make sense? So the API is very, very powerful. Currently, you can only load templates and controllers into views through states. So you define your views, and that's kind of all you get. In the next version, you'll actually be able to say something like, view.load full name of view. Because views are actually nested, and so if you want to target something at the root, it would just be, whatever the name is. But then if it has a child, you could say child, and then just give it a template URL and a controller, and it'll load into that view. So we're actually pulling the parts of the state machine that are responsible for that out into user space so you can manipulate them directly. Some of the other interesting features of this particular project are some of the directives that we use on this page. I'll show you a couple of them. So one thing you'll notice is that this project doesn't have a poster, and we wanted to make it as easy as possible for the managers of this system to add posters to projects and perform different maintenance tasks. So here on my desktop, I have an image that I can just drag onto there, resize, move, and then, resize, move, and then hit enter, and it'll save it to the database and associate it with that project. And this is the code to actually make that happen. So here we're assigning a controller, like a generic controller that manages any kind of images that I want to modify. And here we'll take a look at the code for that. So the image controller attaches a couple of methods to its scope that let you see the state of the image, whether it's being edited or not, and then actually save it. So it hits the database with a post and saves the data and does some updates. And eventually we'll add error handling. So once you actually, to back up quickly, there's this directive called drop target, and it has some associated directives like overclass and ng model and drop. So drop target means this is an element that can accept files dropped onto it. So these are just regular image tags that I'll add the directives to and set some things. So like there's an overclass, so you can see like it's kind of hard to tell. Here, let me see if I can refresh the page. It's It's kind of hard to tell, but there's a slight yellow outline whenever I'm over that, and then it changes to a slight blue outline when editing is actually in progress. So, all of my file manipulation code is in a module called Angular File, obviously, and that is actually available on my company's GitHub account. Let's see if the internet is going to be our friend. We'll give that a minute to load. So UR file defines a directive called drop target. And so this is what a directive definition looks like. You give it the name of the directive in camel case, and then you could actually do that in your templates as a tag like drop target, if I could type, or an attribute like div drop target like we saw. So this is the definition that explains to Angular how it's supposed to work. Most of the magic happens in this link function. So I'm grabbing some different attributes that were also attached to that element. And I'm grabbing the element itself that directive was applied on. And for those of you who have never used Angular before, one of the really powerful things of directives is that they kind of make elements anonymous in the way that, like, if I was going to do something in traditional JavaScript, I would assign like an ID or a set of classes or some other unique kind of selector to this element that I wanted to attach this behavior to. Well, I don't need to do that with Angular. I can just drop an element with an attribute or a particular tag anywhere in my DOM, and I know that Angular will invoke this behavior for me. So I can then take the element and do all of the HTML5 file API hooks that I need to implement in order to use it that way. So I can say, okay, if I'm dropping something, then remove the overclass and take the files and assign them to my model. So when I assign the files to my model, I actually have a property inside the project itself. The actual file object is being assigned to, and then I can take it and say, okay, pull the image data out using the file reader API in HTML5. And
sorry.
Yes.
So what if you are not supporting the file API? What's the action that you would take in that case? In case of this app?
So this particular feature is only used by like a particular set of users on this system. It's not used by just anyone who would show up to it. So we made the decision to only support HTML5 features, but this directive also has, or this module rather, also has another directive that allows you to assign a model to a regular file input, which is not possible in AngularJS natively. So then when someone selects a file, your model is updated, and then you can act on that file. So is there any questions on any of this so far? Did I just totally confuse all of you? I can keep going. Yes?
Oh yeah, I'm totally confused right now.
You're a little confused?
No, pretty much totally.
Okay, awesome. All right, let's dig into that a little bit. So he's completely confused. Can you tell me where I lost you?
No, I mean, like this, quite frankly, I get the feeling that all this magic is like you're either not telling us a lot of things or it actually is magic and I'm programming in the last decade.
Angular does make things feel like that a little bit, but actually it's there are a few elements that are very simple, but you are able to take those elements and build up very complex things. So let's go back to the actual markup here. So this is the image tag that renders the project's poster. And here I'm able to assign a dynamic source attribute. So it's going to evaluate this expression, and that's going to give me back a URL that I can use to actually show the image, right? And then this ngIf will either add or remove that element from the page, depending on how this expression evaluates. So I have this object called project. I have a sub-object in it called UI that has some variables that just manage my UI state, like whether or not an image is loading. So loading will be true or false, whether or not we're currently editing an image. So if either one of those things is true, we actually want to remove this element from the DOM completely. And again, all the drop target stuff to actually manage getting the file to into the scope so we can manage it. So now once this is triggered, once the drop state is triggered, it calls this function to change the state of these variables, such that this element goes away and this element takes its place. So this is another directive called image editor. It's basically just a wrapper for a canvas. So when this renders out, it just renders out as a canvas, but I'm able to assign it these properties so that I can change the behavior without having to go into the JavaScript and change it. So for example, if the dimensions of the image don't match the dimensions of the canvas, I can tell it, I think, fit auto. But I actually don't want that. I just want to be able to scale it manually, so I have it set to fit none. And then I also have all of the the file drop management directives on that as well, so that if I do something I don't like or I just want to pick a different image, I can just go drop that on again and it'll reload. And this directive just adds the different classes depending on the state. So if I'm like hovering over it with a file, it'll have a particular outline. If I'm editing it, it'll have a different outline just to indicate to the user that it's active. And then this just changes the state once content is loaded. So this image editor is actually two things. You provided a binding to like a file or some other source of data that it's going to read from, and then it'll use the file reader API to go and fetch the image data out of the file or whatever you want to use and render it to the canvas. So that is made up of a couple of different canvas. That's made up of a couple of different components. So you have the image editor itself, and the template for that is just an empty canvas that I manipulate in JavaScript. And these are all just different the different code that I use to bind the mouse events. So when you're dragging, it's moving or scaling. Then I have this scope. My scope object that lives on the page in the region where the canvas is rendered. Scope has a method called watch that allows you to watch an expression for changes. So here I'm saying as soon as this model attribute, so if you see over here, I'm assigning the model of the canvas to this logo property on my project. And here I'm able to watch that and say, okay, anytime this updates, give me the new data. And what this is saying is, okay, if there's a valid value and it's a file, then I'm going to throw this in my file handler, which is just a wrapper around the HTML5 file reader API. And it exposes that functionality, but wrapped in the Angular's promise API so that I can chain off of it asynchronously. So this is saying once that value is loaded, once all the bytes have been read from the file, then give me the value of those bytes, and I'm going to update this box. And the box is an instance of this class that I created called image projector, which is just defined up here. So we have an image projector that we give some options to Basically, all it is a simple way to project an image onto a canvas with specific position and bounds. Does that all make sense so far?
And where do you define the bounds and those kind of things with the projector?
Yeah, so the projector kind of keeps track of the image in the canvas and whatever manipulation that I do. So by default, it starts off at x0, y0 with whatever the native dimensions of the image are. And then as I manipulate this is keeping track of whatever I did last and updating the image and how it renders in the canvas. And that's what all of these event bindings are for. Does that make sense? Cool. Yes?
How does all this generated code affects when debugging using like Chrome Inspector or Firebug, for example?
Okay. So the question was, how does this affect debugging? Usually no more than, well, in some cases your stack traces get a little weird. But after like a short time of working with Angular, you start to recognize where things are being executed, because usually the errors are thrown in your own code. And so if there's something wrong here, I can just say debugger, and yeah. Oh yeah, I need to have this active for debugging to work. There we go. So I just made a change, and I can actually just jump in here, and you can see my my stack trace is actually not even that big. Because I have jQuery loaded on this page for other widgets that we're using, it automatically Angular automatically uses it to do selectors and manipulation. Otherwise, if you're not using jQuery, it has its own version called JQ Lite, which is basically just a selector engine and basic DOM manipulations. So anyway, I can jump in here through my stack trace, and again, a lot of this is just my code, so I can look and understand and see. Oh, okay, data is some hex data, and whatever else. Does that answer your question?
Yes. All of these changes show instantly when inspected in the DOM. Let's say you drop an image in your demo, and then you have the image tag with the source, the path to that image. Let's say you drop another image from another path. Does that instantly?
Yeah. So so what you're seeing there is excuse me. Let's get rid of this. All right. So yeah, what you're seeing is there's an image that's being loaded from the server, and then I'm loading a new image that replaces that, and then the image tag is gone, and it's replaced with a canvas. You don't see it because the image data is the same.
Okay.
So this right now is not an image tag; it's actually a canvas. Now, once I hit enter, it's going to go save it to my database on my backend, and on my backend I'm using MongoDB with GridFS. So I'm just going to save the image data directly to GridFS. And then the server is going to give me back a URL that I can use to reference that image data in my image tag.
Okay. Thank you.
You need XHR2, right? To do that.
Yes. So you do need XHR2 to do that again, which is why I'm targeting like only new browsers. But the other way to do it would be you just use a regular file input. And you can still get pretty far with a regular file input by making it hidden, like opacity 0, and then allowing people to drag files onto it, which works in most browsers except like Firefox 3. So you can even not targeting the very latest browsers, you can still get pretty far, posting to an iframe instead of using XHR2. So these things are all possible. It's just, I didn't want to have to write code for that. But there are plenty of libraries like the jQuery file upload library. I think it actually comes with an Angular wrapper module, so you can use that in your Angular projects and have cross-browser file manipulation that way. Obviously, it's going to be a couple of more round trips because you have to push the image data up before you can get it back to go on the canvas and stuff. Yes.
I'm used to do all these things like going through a model and retrieve a filter, all with PHP.
Okay.
Why would you tell us to leave our comfort zone of PHP and on to doing this? Because I believe if you're using Angular, PHP is more like you do API calls with it, right?
So the question was, why are you asking us to leave our comfort zone, which is PHP? So I guess the question behind that is like, what's the benefit?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. Well, first of all, so these things that I'm demonstrating, how would you even begin to do that with PHP?
Yeah.
So for me, the reason it's important for two reasons. One is that you're able to create really great user experiences, right? Like this is so much more smooth and fluid than anything we could do just a few years ago, without a lot of effort. And the second thing is it keeps front-end stuff on the front end. Like the more I started using Angular, the more I found generating templates with PHP, even with things like Twig, just tedious. The great thing about Angular as opposed to some other similar JavaScript frameworks is that your template is the DOM itself. There's no HTML strings. You can use HTML strings, but they get embedded in the DOM before they get processed. So when you're manipulating the page, you're manipulating it live, and there's no conceptual issues because, like, if you've ever had a list and tried to replace the elements in those lists with like inner HTML, you lose all your event bindings, right? So Angular totally does away with this by making it so that the DOM itself is your template. So this is a really, really powerful concept. Does that answer your question more or less? Okay. Yes?
How do you serve the JavaScript files? Do you use require.js or something like that?
Right now, we're basically, here, I'll show you. It's nothing special. So what we do is we have this in development, and then we have a grunt task that compiles it down to, we have these comment directives here that compile all of our libraries into one minified JavaScript file called lib.js. And we still have to refactor because some of these, like Angular, should probably be loaded from a CDN. But then for our application files, again, they all just get compiled into a minified JavaScript file that's used in production. So, and with Angular's module system, as long as you are loading things in the right order, which since you're doing all your loading on one page, it's really easy. The module system sort of sorts itself out. So here I can say with my canvas, right, because I'm manipulating image data in files, I'm going to depend on this file module. Yes, in the back.
Are you using the one branch in all your production projects? Is there any risk to consider? I mean, I have a 1.0 project and I've always been scared about moving.
So the question was about upgrading versions of AngularJS from 1.0 to 1.1 to 1.2. So 1.2 is in beta it's in release candidate right now. Unfortunately, they're not using semantic versioning because they broke a bunch of stuff. But it was mostly with stuff that was already new in 1.1. Upgrading from 1.0 to 1.1, as I recall, was pretty straightforward. There wasn't a lot of issues there. You had your hand up?
Do you use something to upgrade the code or just unify?
Sorry, minify or what?
Obfuscate the code.
Oh, obfuscating the code. No, it's just standard like minification tool chain. So like we have a grunt task that just does the, I forget which one we're using, but they're kind of like uglify, closure, they're all kind of the same. Yes?
What about SEO when you are serving the content dynamically? What about the crawlers?
Yeah, so SEO is a very good point. There's not a lot in AngularJS natively that makes that easy for you. Most of the solutions, although the core team has talked about working on that, currently most of the solutions involve things that happen server side, like spinning up Phantom.js and actually loading up your page and extracting the HTML to a separate file and then serving that to search engines. So it's a little bit, there's a little bit of setup in the beginning, but once you have that set up, it's very easy to just let it run and you don't have to worry about it again. Yes?
How do you manage authentication?
How do we manage authentication? That's a great question. Usually either with HTTP auth, as in the case of this application, or just using cookies. Like we just use JavaScript to write a cookie based on information that comes back from the server, and we just keep sending it back to the server. So it takes, like you have to do your own cookie management if you're going to use cookies, but it's simple. And there are plenty of libraries out there already that will, actually we wrote one. So Angular has a built-in cookie library, but it doesn't allow you to manipulate like domain or path or things like that. So actually, github.com/UOR, that's where all my company's public Angular stuff is. So we've got modules for files and the Canvas one, both of those that were demoed. Those are available. Our cookie library is available. One for doing translations, which is kind of fun because, again, everything's totally live. So if you go here and suddenly it's in French or Spanish. I didn't translate our Spanish, so if it's wrong, it's not my fault. But that's the great thing about using a system like this is everything is just totally instant. But yeah, your question was about cookies. Sorry. So yeah, you can just manipulate them through JavaScript. Yes?
Now that you touched the internationalization stuff, how do you keep that in I don't know.
Well, it's we use a very simple approach. So, like this is a translation string, and it renders this text here to share a project, and then our language definitions. Here. So here's the definition in English, definition in Spanish. So we just have separate files with separate languages.
That's all public, right?
Yeah, all the language files. Yeah, we just did it all in one. Like you could split your JSON files up by like section of a site or whatever if it was important to have that text protected for some reason. But yeah, for us, it's just.
So you use a filter once or every time for every key?
Yeah, so it's once for every key. So we have this filter called T, and it looks like that every time. And we're adding some features so you can have like this as your scope, and then you just do share project.
So you have to write a type key every time you want to translate something?
Unfortunately, yes. There are other approaches.
My main question.
Yeah, there are other approaches that you could take by interacting with Angular's template expression evaluator, but we opted for like a simple and explicit approach.
Okay. Also, there were a couple of words in Spanish that were not correctly translated.
I didn't translate it.
For you to know.
Oh yeah. It's actually our client does produces and distributes movie trailers internationally. So they actually have companies that will go translate all their subtitles and dialogue and everything. So I'll tell those guys that their vendor is crap. Yes.
So can you describe a little more detail what happened when you clicked and changed the language? 'Cause obviously we don't keep all of the client side all the time, right?
No, so it's just it's language files that are just being loaded dynamically. So when I hit that, it actually loaded the the French and the Spanish JavaScript file or JSON file rather.
Goes back and pulls it from the server.
Yeah.
And then reapplies it to the DOM.
Right. Right. So I have a service. So I have a service called Angular G11 and Angular Globalization that exposes this locale object. So that's what I'm using in my controllers when somebody clicks. I set, I think it's here. Anyway, one of these functions. Oh yeah, here we go. So you go locale.uses whatever locale, and then it switches this, which is just like a variable inside of locale's scope, and that changes everything that the locale service serves. So you have this T filter. It accesses the locale service, and anytime the value of this language variable changes, it changes what this thing returns. So I didn't have to write any code to make that happen other than just saying locale.uses Spanish, and it just did it. Yes?
What about performance? Have you ever encountered any situation in which Angular didn't behave? I don't know.
We encountered one situation where we had, I think it was something like 10 or 15,000 DOM elements on a page that all were having behavior applied to them. So basically what we did is we figured out a way to have it such that the behavior was applied on like a parent element, and that problem went away. Mm-hmm.
Do Angular has some modules to work with or WebSockets or things like that?
Yeah, there are. I'm going to try and wrap it up because we're at time, unfortunately. But you guys can find me later. There are several community-provided plugins for dealing with WebSockets. A really great service though is a thing called Firebase. It's like database, unmanaged database in like WebSockets in one. And there's a plugin called Angular Fire where you drop it into your application. Is just basically magical because you're typing things and they're automatically updating the database, and anybody else who's watching my page is updating for them too. So it's pretty cool. Okay, one more.
Why should we choose Angular over Ember or Backward?
So it's a good question. I'm not going to speak to Ember because that's another talk in itself. You can find me after and I'll talk to you about it. But okay, so Backbone is better than jQuery Soup because it gives you a way to organize jQuery Soup. But if you know how to structure JavaScript applications, there's nothing else that Backbone really does for you. Does that make sense? So it doesn't have the automatic data binding and all of this just totally magical, amazing stuff that Angular has.
I expected Ember.
Sorry?
I expected you answer about Ember.
All right. Well, yeah. So am I done?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. Thanks for all the great questions and everything.